right, I'm going to keep this quick since a lot of this is going to be reiteration of the last couple presentations. So just your potential use cases here. We're talking interactive media, time-sensitive media. Really things that are not peer-to-peer, as we've kind of discussed already. So kind of the breakdown of the various causes. As we've seen, we've got encoding the CDN side of things and playback. I've condensed it. And playback really accounts for about half of latency in the pipeline. So optimizing the player tends to kind of be the key to making this all work. So some quick encoding overview. You can get rid of things like B-frames, which take forever on the encoding side. This is at a trade-off for quality. With CMAF, we are dealing with closed GOP sizes, so we can keep them small. You can maintain the encoding buffer size, and so on and so forth. And just kind of to reiterate from the last presentation, you can have like individual frames in chunks, and make up those chunks into fragments, and then make up fragments into segments. And essentially, where the optimization comes into play is you can take the CMAF chunk and treat it as a HTTP chunk on the origin, and start transferring those very intelligently. So as described previously, you want to use HTTP 1.1 chunk transfer for all of these requests, and help propagate that across various edges. So I'll just go straight into playback. The kind of four main challenges to deal with is we deal with this playback drift, where when you're playing back HTTP streaming, you tend to fall behind the live edge quite a bit. Knowing exactly where the live edge is as well is a very difficult thing to kind of maintain. When we're talking close to live, we want to deal with very short buffers. So we need to learn to manage that, and just the user playback experience, because in the end, that's who's watching it, and that's who matters. So the first thing I want to discuss in a little more detail is the proposed dash extension for the availability time offset. And usually up until now, the player will send a request for the entire segment when it's available. But what availability time offset will give us is it gives us the difference of the start time of the segment and the UTC time of the server when it can start delivering the segment. So we can know exactly when it's available to start fetching that first one frame chunk. And we can then, essentially it's the equivalent of the segment duration minus the chunk duration minus this mismatch. So it really gives us this granularity in being able to get frame by frame accuracy of when we need to request segments in chunks. Another thing we've implemented in our player side of things is actually not trusting the device timestamp and using an NTP server to sync that as well. That way we can be sure that when we're requesting these fragments, that they're less likely to 404. There's still obviously the possibility of that, so you have to deal with essentially a buffer underrun. So the kind of key here then is this drift that happens that we all are. We have to deal with catch-up behavior. So there's three different things we've essentially dealt with. The first is you do nothing and you end up drifting so far behind. The second is you actually can set a threshold for, okay, I want to stay, say, 2 seconds behind the live edge and speed up the playback. So to the end user watching the content, they get, a slightly sped up version, but you're not dealing with buffering events or skipping ahead. So it's actually quite a smooth way of dealing with this. And it seems to be quite a good quality of experience trade-off, even though you might be somewhat behind the live edge. You can then have a second threshold that if it gets past that, you could then implement the seek, or you could implement the seek instantly, and that way you cut whatever you're playing, skip a bunch of content, and go to the live edge. So that's kind of the key to chasing this. So underruns are, a big thing with low latency. Like we talk about the player knowing if segments are available, and there's still obviously cases where they might 404. So you need to be able to preemptively say when this event happens that you need to start buffering more, so on and so forth. Essentially, the kind of, it's all about keeping the quality of experience, because if it starts happening once, it's likely to start happening again. So it's about adapting the playback behavior to kind of stay as close to the live edge as possible while not seeing these kind of drastic events that users deal with. And finally, so keeping all this stuff in sync, we really can not only chase the live edge from like as low as possible, but we can, with this granularity, actually define like very strict guidelines. So, if you want to follow 5 seconds specifically, you can do that, and that way you can have essentially multiple users all watching at the same time, even though the data might be available more reasonably. And the further that you are from the live edge, for example, you have more chance of caching being in place for segments and whatnot. So you can get better quality once again. But using these timing elements with like availability time offset, for example, we can kind of granularly know where exactly each frame is. So in the future, as with the Twitch presentation, ABR is a huge issue with this because you're doing chunk transfer, so you're only getting short segments. Another thing we've noticed is that the actual decoding pipelines on various devices have quite different latencies involved, so you need to kind of manage that as in the buffer logic, and obviously improving quality over time. So I'll keep that short because I know you guys want lunch, so questions?
Where's the... There's a question?
That one's dead now?
Was that microphone done?
No, I think the other one did.
I'll just ask loudly, in practice, what sort of sustainable latency regimes are you comfortable supporting in production?
In production,
Latency on, say, iOS, Android, and web?
On production, we're seeing about, I would confidently say 3 seconds stable, with improvements on Android up to 2. iOS tends to be the slower of them with our Dash implementation due to the decoding pipeline. But 3 seconds is probably a reasonable confidence that I'm able to say.
You mentioned drift in the case where you were falling further behind live edge. Do you also have a case where you are drifting closer to the live edge and then you're going to underrun your buffer?
Yes, so you essentially have to start retrying chunks at this point again, and you then need to adapt the buffer logic to fill it more so you don't have a chance of underrunning again, but not significantly much more than trying to stay at the live edge. So if you try to chase the live edge to, say, a second granularity, you tend to not run into underruns as much as if you're trying to chase it like at the live edge.
Yeah. Do you solve that problem by changing the speed of decoding or by rebuffering?
By rebuffering, essentially. and changing the way that the player logic is handling future buffer events from when it underruns.
Thank you.
Just as a comment, you said you didn't use B-frames because of the delay. As a fine point, B-frames haven't been associated with delay since MPEG 2. You should...
Well, I was just meaning certain things.
Proper terminology would be to say you don't use picture reordering.
Yes, sorry.
But you can use B-frames without adding any delay in the more modern codecs.
Any other question? No? All right. Thanks again.